It's always been about teaching and empowering visionaries. I fundamentally believe that if you understand the language of business, which is accounting, you are just that much more likely to succeed in your business.
Welcome to the Horizon Lab podcast. In this episode, we're featuring Tony Wilson, who is the founder of ACCUIP. ACCUIP is a fractional CFO for digital agencies. Tony wants to give the power of financial insights back to the business owners. So, without further ado, let's welcome Tony. Hey, Tony, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me, man. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. So tell me a bit about the idea for ACCUIP and how it came about. What was the vision? How did it really stand out compared to other fractional CFOs in the space?
Yeah. Well, I like to tell people that my entrepreneurial journey really came about in like three pivotal moments. So, first pivotal moment was back in 2010 when I launched my very first business with my brother, photography design business with my brother. That's where I learned and I kind of got caught the entrepreneurial bug. I was like, oh, this is fun. I love doing entrepreneurship. So that was all the way back in 2010. Second pivotal moment was one of my roommates. He was a trim carpenter and he went back to a coding boot camp or went to a coding boot camp and became a software developer. Because at the time of him being a trim carpenter, really struggling just to kind of make ends meet and thinking about the idea of like having a family someday, it was like, this is not attainable. But then his transition into software development really opened up a lot of doors. And so I saw in that leap, just a lot of really amazing things that being in the software development world can do for you. So that was the second pivotal moment. The third pivotal moment, the final one that really kind of just, kind of my clarion moment was I was holding my very first daughter. And as I'm holding her, I'm thinking to myself, man, this little girl, like I want her to know that she can do anything she sets her mind to. And yet I felt like I was holding my own self back from all these dreams and passions that I had to go and just do my own business, right? Because I was in corporate America, so I was quite comfortable there. And so I'm looking at her and I felt a little bit like I was being hypocritical. And it was that moment that said, now's the time. I need to take this risk, if for nothing else, so that my kids can grow up and see that their dad tried. And even if you fail, like it's fine. I haven't failed, but those are my key kind of pivotal moments in getting into entrepreneurship. And then in terms of like the actual creation of ACCUIP itself, ACCUIP has always been about education first and foremost. It's always been about teaching and empowering visionaries. I fundamentally believe that if you understand the language of business, which is accounting, you are just that much more likely to succeed in your business. So first and foremost, we start on a layer and a base of education in everything that we do. So that would be one way I think that we're a little bit different. We're not just going to be a service provider. We're a coach and a mentor to help educate you and keep you apprised of these things. And I think another thing that we do a lot different than some other fractional CFOs or other accountants is our approach is really meant to be very integrated and white glove, right? So you think about like, I mean, of all of the dev agencies or, any other digital agency that's out there, many of them are on Slack, for example. You will be hard pressed to find accountants who are like, yes, let me come and be on your Slack. Let me be in your Slack and be available on Slack. A lot of times you're going to be behind a wall of email. And I just don't believe in that. Like I believe in a much more white glove integrated approach because I think learning happens in the margins. It doesn't happen in convenient, stage-gated time zones.
Interesting. So you think that having that communication, that one-on-one direct communication really helps other business owners
100%.
to be able to understand, have access to the mentor and then to make better decisions, right?
Totally. I mean, you think about it. I mean, how many times are there things that are funneling in your mind, just, whatever it might be on a day-to-day basis. And the more friction you put between that curiosity and the person who might have an answer, the less likely it is that you're going to go and actually get that question answered, right? You think about it, like we all go to Google because it's just a couple keystrokes away. So we have a lot of access to it. So we go to that a lot. We don't oftentimes just go to talk to that person down the street because there's some resistance to going and doing that. So my thought is the more we can remove out some of that resistance, the more likely you are to engage that educational resource.
That's awesome, man. So can you explain to me and the viewers what a fractional CFO is and what exactly they do?
Yeah. So a couple ways to slice this. So on the one end, just purely practical, it's fractional CFO because quite honestly, until you're at like 10, 15, 20 million in revenue, it doesn't make sense to hire a full-time CFO. I mean, economically, it doesn't make sense because these people cost a lot of money. So from a fractional standpoint, there's a cost saving component to it. Also, reality is businesses aren't that complex. And so oftentimes you're not needing the full bandwidth of a full-time CFO, and especially in the agency space, a lot of times fractional CFO is really helpful in things like helping to, yeah, we'll talk some on strategy and some of these higher level pieces, but also some more practical pieces like, hey, let's work on setting some budgets and some goals for this next year, and also cash flow forecasting. Let's look to the future. Let's start to forecast out some of your revenue based on some information that we have. And those are some of the things that if you just go to a bookkeeper, you're not going to get that level of help. Occasionally, you'll also see in fractional CFO, you'll also see like a meaningful diving into and understanding what the numbers mean. Whereas again, if you have a bookkeeper, you'll probably get a report out of QuickBooks and that's about it.
Do you find that doing revenue forecasting for a smaller business is a lot more difficult? I know there's different types of businesses. A lot of software agencies, it's more of a feast or famine cycle and not so much like a reoccurring revenue cycle. So if someone's in a feast or famine model and they're a smaller company, isn't that more difficult to forecast?
There are complexities for sure. And I think this is where I think a lot of the more cookie cutter tech solutions that are out there don't do this industry justice. A lot of times when you go and you say, I want a cash flow forecasting tool, QuickBooks has their own, there's other tools I could talk about too. But most of them, like 99% of them, are geared towards a SaaS business model, which SaaS in a lot of ways is kind of the exact opposite of a dev agency or a digital agency because it is super predictable. You've got your MRR or your ARR, depending on how you do your contracts. You've got a certain degree of predictable churn that you can incorporate into that model. And so modeling out that forecast, that revenue forecast, is a lot more just a math game. But to your point, you're talking about like that feast and famine cycle. A lot of times we're talking project-oriented agencies, which is a lot of software, it's more project-oriented. You do have some of those ups and downs. And so this is actually one of the ways that we forecast differently than a lot of those tech tools is we're actually looking at CRM data. Now, to your question, isn't it a lot harder? I would say yes. And I think one of the limiting factors a lot of times is in associating what deal stage a specific deal is and then saying the percent likelihood that they are to close. Because we can do some like benchmarks and we can say typically this is 70% likely to close, but it's going to be a lot different depending on your sales cycle and your process.
Interesting. So you mentioned looking at the CRM. So do you, as fractional CFO, actually jump into the CRM and look around?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah.
I would say a lot of times when we first start our engagement, a fractional CFO engagement with our clients, we also sometimes play a little bit of a role of trying to help them tighten up what they're doing with their CRM. Obviously, we're not the marketers, we're not the salespeople, but we approach it from a standpoint of like, we are data people. And we do think that there's valuable data to be had from a CRM. So we'll do things like, hey, I know before you would update your CRM kind of haphazardly. Well, now we do a weekly cash flow forecast. We need you to have that updated by this time on this date in order for us to be successful. So we're going to put some guardrails around, help establish some best practices, help maybe even define some of those deal stages for them based on what we're seeing from our other clients.
Interesting. And do you find that a lot of startups maybe don't have the sales processes defined enough to be able to do what you're describing?
Totally. Absolutely. Yeah. And I would bifurcate, startup from digital agency. I mean, they both kind of operate similarly in the very early stages, but they start to kind of really go in two separate directions. So if we're talking startup, like a tech startup, I would say yes. I think they probably will struggle a little bit until they start getting into funding. Because a lot of times you start getting outside funding, there's going to be a little bit more stipulations and expectations that you have a certain maturity in your sales process. But digital agencies, I've seen some that get to, 5 to 8 million in revenue and they still don't have very well-defined sales processes.
And so when you jump into a company like that, how do you start doing the forecasting? How do you have those conversations if they don't have a defined package? Every deal size is different. They don't even really have a process for the sales team.
Yeah.
How do you work with that?
Man, it is a very iterative process. I would say it's typically what will happen is I'm asking the questions that haven't really been asked before, or they have have been asked, but they haven't necessarily followed through on getting an answer to. And so part of the role that I'm playing is also just kind of like championing the cause of this is why this is important. So you actually brought up a really great point, which is when we're talking about project-based revenue or custom software, my goodness sakes, there's not this is always going to be $100,000 project. It's like, it really depends. And so, yeah, how do you put that deal size in? Sometimes what this can help us to do is it can help us to put our hands around, hey, oh, and by the way, you actually will be better served to continue to grow your agency by starting to limit the variables and limit the variability to start getting things a little bit more productized. Don't have to be entirely productized, but get things a little bit more in some ranges, right? So that's one of the things I did with one of my clients is, they as we kind of broke things down, what really emerged was you had kind of like three broad categories. You kind of had this more entry level offering, this really low stakes, low dollar amount. Then you kind of had this mid tier, and then you had this like massive one, and they all came with different needs, and they all came with kind of slightly different ways that they move through the sales process, right? The multi-million dollar projects are likely going to involve RFPs, probably going to have a much longer sales cycle, all these kinds of things. So I'd say having those conversations really drives people towards getting a little bit more clarity, even around their offering.
Interesting. And so, take a business that has a feast or famine cycle. How do you make good decisions with the feast or famine cycle? You forecast the revenue out. That's true, but how do you make sure that they hit payroll every month? Maybe they're in a famine cycle. How do you know those famine cycles are going to occur? How can you predict
Yeah.
those?
I'd say the number one indicator of an upcoming or an impending famine cycle is how much today they are investing in their sales and marketing. In my experience, talking with different, agency owners, and then also working with my own clients, what I see when we first start working together, we first kind of peel back the layers, is typically agencies are spending anywhere between 3 to 8% of their revenues on sales and marketing. And that is way too little. It sounds like, oh, that's a lot, that's a decent amount of money, but that's way too little. Right. And I'll just even quote Nick Petrosky. Love the dude, does amazing work in the digital agency space. Go check him out if you can. He did some research on this because he pooled, I want to say like 200 plus digital agencies and got some feedback on how much they're spending. And his research came back with 7.1%. So well within my range that I'm seeing a 3 to 8%. And we both agreed it's not enough money to spend to be investing in your sales and marketing. When I'm coaching my clients for the first time and they haven't really done a really great job establishing their go-to-market strategy, I'm saying that number needs to be more like 15 to 20% of your total revenues need to be spent on sales and marketing. I would say there is a direct correlation between how much you're investing today versus there's a correlation there to whether or not you're going to be running into a famine cycle in 6, 8, 12 months down the road.
Interesting. And you said that, the 7-8% is pretty low. Obviously you want it to be higher. That being said, how does those buckets get defined? You said sales and marketing. Those are two entirely different things,
Totally.
right? Marketing's more trying to build brand awareness and build inbound channels, right? Whereas sales is kind of the opposite, doing direct outbound.
Yep.
How do you usually see the diversification of money in terms of success in those two areas?
Yeah. I think the reason why I like to lump them together, I like to bucket them together, is because I see it working. I see them working in tandem based on what the needs are in the moment, right? So let's say you're my client and we're projecting out, yeah, we're okay on revenue for the next 2 or 3 months, but after that, we're seeing a significant decrease, which by the way is not uncommon in agency space. But let's just say 2 to 3 months down the road, we're looking at that. What we're coming up against here is we're recognizing that there is a more short-term need to get more deals in pipeline. So anytime I'm faced with forecasting revenue that's really short in the short term, I'm going to prioritize more outbound type strategies, things that are more direct. So like you said, maybe more gearing towards more sales type motions. When I've built up a really good and solid base and I don't have as much of that immediate pressure that I need to get deals in pipeline, I start to then shift some of that investment more towards the marketing side. And that's not to say that we're going to completely neglect marketing, because I think you do need to have some marketing going at all times for sure. What I'm saying is, you might be, let's say your budget for a given month is $8,000. The immediate need might be, we just need to get deals in door. So we're going to prioritize outbound channels. We might say, we're going to shift that to say 6,000 is going to be invested in sales, maybe only 2,000 is on marketing. But then once we get to that good equilibrium point, we can now see a little bit more of that swing where we say, we're going to deprioritize outbound channels. We're going to, grow our YouTube presence. We're going to start that podcast. We're going to do some of these other inbound, broader marketing tactics and strategies because we have the runway to do that.
Do you find that the inbound, being the long-term play, has the more exponential growth in comparison to the direct outbound?
At one point, I would say I thought that was the case. That was my hypothesis. I think the more I work with digital agencies, I'm not convinced about that. And this is why I say that. For a SaaS business model, it is purely a numbers game. This is the reason why SaaS always gets these astronomical, valuations, is because it really just comes down to just keep chunking more money in, and you're just going to get more and more returns with very, very little financial leverage because you have massive gross margins for SaaS companies. For something like a digital agency, you're never going to fully get that full scale flywheel effect because the whole business model is predicated on labor, right? Like that's what it is to be a digital agency. Is you're a labor shop. And so you're never fully going to get that huge kind of scale. And because of the nature of the work that we're doing, it's so high trust that unlike, getting Liquid Death, for example, great brand example for like they could spend a ton in marketing and they can just continue to spend more and more and get a lot that scale factor because the nature of the product lends itself to that kind of return. For something more like software development where it is more custom, there's always going to need to be that personal touch and that personal connection that they have with the founders or the business development person who's selling the project. So I'm not convinced that just spending a ton in marketing is the way to see exponential growth. I just don't know exponential growth ever fully happens in a digital agency.
Interesting. How big or small do you think a company needs to be to start maybe contemplating having a CFO on board or a fractional CFO?
Yeah, I'd say there's a couple different factors. I don't know that there's a hard and fast dollar amount. I would say certainly if you're below 500,000 in revenue, it just doesn't, like the financials just don't make sense for that. There are ways that you can engage with somebody like a fractional CFO in like maybe a lesser extent, but full fractional CFO, like if you're below 500,000, economics are just not there. Oftentimes what I see is most digital agencies feel most comfortable and confident in taking somebody like that on once they've passed $1 million in revenue, which I think is perfectly legitimate. That being said, I think there are good ways for us to have a fractional CFO access to somebody like that without the full package by doing things like being part of a mastermind group. That's actually something that we're launching here in the next month or so. Is like a small cohort, so you still have access to that person at a much more approachable price point.
So you were saying that under $500,000, it doesn't really make sense to bring on a fractional CFO. That being said, are there resources or things that those people can do that they should be paying attention to that would help drive the needle? Or do you think that they just need to focus on other areas of their business first and grow it out before they even think about it?
Yeah, I would say, in my early days, I'd say, yeah, I really focus on, these finance topics. But the reality is if you're under 500,000 in revenue, your number one goal is to just get out there and sell. It's the only way you're going to get to that spot where you even have enough financial wherewithal to care enough about some of these financial topics, right? Like even if somebody comes to me and says, I want to do financial forecasting and they're making 350K a year in revenue, I'd say like, I can't in good conscience even sell you that because like, I know enough to know that you don't actually need that. You just need to get out there and sell better. So I'm going to put them in contact with my coaches, like my whole network of people who do excellent work and, training you up in your sales and your marketing and that kind of stuff for digital agencies and solopreneurs. I think some of the pains that we feel, we assume are finance related, but finance is just the downstream impact of upstream issues, which is almost always sales in the agency space.
Interesting. So I always try to end the podcast with a fun question. So if you could give your younger self financial advice, what would that advice be?
Oh man. It would probably go back to my entrepreneurial journey, which is to say, take more risk when you're younger. Just go for it. This idea or this notion that you have to get like all of this really important pedigree and experience before you launch out on your own, I think is maybe like a couple years. It's helpful to learn on somebody else's dime, but did I really need a decade in order to launch out on and do this? No, I don't think I did. So I would say take more risks earlier on, because then it compounds. It has a much better impact later on.
That's lovely, man. And if anybody wanted to reach out to you to get some fractional CFO services, how could they find you?
Yeah. They can find me on LinkedIn. I'm not posting as regularly as I used to, but I'm still very much active. I check it every single day. So reach out to me on LinkedIn. I'm also growing my YouTube channel. So go follow me there. I'll be posting some more educational video content there, as well as our podcast, the Dev Launch Podcast. So people can go check that out. But yeah, if anybody wants to, they can also reach out to me directly. My email address is tony@acquip.com. That's ACCQUIP.com.
We will leave links to all that down below. Thank you so much for joining the podcast, Tony. I really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for having me, Austin. This has been great.
Thank you.